There's a very famous phrase where you say the Stone Age didn't end for lack of stone. It ended because people came up with different ideas. So one of the fun parts about this, a lot of PhDs in economics have been written about the currency of yap. Basically, one day a stone fell in the ocean and they couldn't find the stone. So they said, well, look, we're going to keep referring to that one stone because it has a lot of value. And so it became the first virtual currency. And everyone on the island would know the value of it, and they knew where the stone was, but they couldn't pull it up because it's too heavy. So eventually, everyone on the island was able to validate the currency, and that's kind of this first idea of blockchain ledger. So to me, at least, these are really fun examples of when artists help you reimagine what is possible both financially and, of course, how we represent something. So Da Vinci onto the island of Yap. So I'm up here because I went to Antarctica for a while and did a series of acoustic compositions of portraits of ice. And I was in Antarctica for 6 weeks, and what I was doing was looking at how different kinds of ice transform under different temperature differentials. So what I ended up doing was taking that to Sundance, and it was presented by Robert Redford, and we did a series of initiatives of how art and science have a better and more robust conversation when data is actually viewed as a creative process. And to me, at least, what's happening right now in the 21st century, and this is something me and Tom are going to riff on, is that we've had this kind of strange gap between how people can imagine what is potentially available and what's happening, and solutions. So, there's a very famous phrase, like I was saying earlier, the Stone Age didn't end for lack of stone. But my motto these days for the 21st century, and this is something I want to riff on with Tom, is that the imagination is the ultimate renewable resource. If we can imagine something, then we can actually begin to reconceptualize solutions. And that's what I think this whole series of discussions has been about. A little bit more on the financial side, a little bit more on how people are looking at philanthropy. But we now need to rethink what you call cultural capital. And it's not necessarily about what you invest in, but how you can leverage cultural capital to change. So Tom, let's jump into your tree stuff, because I really wanted to kind of riff with you on that, because it's been fascinating seeing you kind of talk about the Trillion Trees initiative. So before we do that, I want to kind of evoke everyone with one other conversation that was a very powerful moment in history, and that's when these two gentlemen met. Einstein was in the middle of finishing his equations for the general theory of relativity and had writer's block. And so whenever he'd have writer's block, he'd go play violin. He was actually a very talented violinist. So when he won the Nobel Prize, backstage was Rabindranath Tagore, who was one of India's most renowned poets. And they ended up having a conversation about poetry and science. And eventually they ended up writing a book together called On the Nature of Reality. That was a very important thing. But right now, the conversation needs to be between the arts, the sciences, the economists, and so on. So that's where I think the conversation with me and Tom here is kind of a little bit of a fun update of some of this kind of the creative economy, as many people are calling it. So Tom, let's talk about the Trees Initiative. Do you want to kind of, you were talking about carbon drawdown yesterday and how trees are some of the best resources for that, but they also have their own network systems too, the root systems and other things. How do you...
Are you going to sit down or are you going to stand up?
All right.
Everything can happen.
All right, there we go. I'll switch mics. Okay, there we go. Hey.
Yeah. Yes. Creativity. Yes. So I was ready to talk about tragedy and stuff, but this is a good angle. We're going to do this angle. So check this out. Okay. Yes. Creativity. Oh, so quick thought, because we already heard it earlier in the day, was like, we're trying to get infinite economic growth on a planet of finite resources. And yeah, kind of, except imagination truly is infinite. And let me describe to you, yes, there is a physical limit to things. There's a certain number of atoms, a certain amount of energy that's available on Earth. But when I say things are infinite, imagine the journey of a photon, right? It comes from the sun, and when it gets to the Earth, there's a couple different ways that things can turn out. Maybe it hits a rock and then it just radiates back to space. And in the process, it basically helped no one. It heated up a rock and radiated back to space. Or, if it were to hit a solar panel and power a home, well, it's helped one organism. So that's pretty cool. Or, if it were to hit a plant and then become part of that plant and nurture the roots and nurture the soil and get eaten by a critter and then get eaten by more critters, it might actually help 50 organisms before it radiates back to heat. And this is kind of the energetic cascade from the entry point to the kind of the waste heat position of any photon. And actually there's an infinite amount of creativity that can happen there. And life is actually really good at expressing that creativity. What we need to step up to as a civilization is having that same level of creativity. Like a solar panel is like not bad, 1 is better than 0 in terms of organisms benefited. But if we actually use as a metric, how many organisms can I benefit with every bit of energy that I use? That is an infinitely deep resource.
Woo. Yes. Yeah. So, all right, so let's unpack that because, again, Einstein E equals mc squared is about how we convert light, C, into all sorts of different kinetic issues. So, U.S. military-industrial complex got a hold of that equation, and then next thing you know, you have a nuclear bomb. And if you think about World War II, basically, one could argue it was an information war. So Alan Turing, on one hand, helped crack the German codes, was able to develop computers, and then, of course, now as we move further and further into a computational-based society, these are issues that are all going to be energy intensive. And me and Chip were talking about this earlier, stuff like 5G is going to be taking a lot more energy to make pretty much every aspect of your phone, all of the data being transmitted. We're going to be seeing a huge increase in the energy intensity of computational power. So here we are in Aspen, and what's the most fascinating thing right now is I just got off an airplane from Hiroshima, and here I'm going to jump up to the podium again. So give me.
No problem. It's all good. I was just messing with you.
Yeah. All right. So I was just in Hiroshima, and I want to show you guys this because it's pretty wild. This is Asahi Shimbun. We had a huge die-in on 8:15 a.m. at Ground Zero, where the first nuclear bomb fell. So we had 10,000 plus people. Asahi Shimbun is the second largest newspaper in Japan. They did a big feature about it. So we had thousands of people all laid down at 8:15 a.m. to protest the Japanese government's policies on Fukushima. And it was a pretty powerful moment. The Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, he's a Trump puppet, basically. Fukushima and Chernobyl, and of course here in Colorado, you guys had the Rocky Flats plutonium disaster. These are all when human beings poorly manage incredibly powerful resources. But there's other options like hydrogen, of course, thorium, and the way that we think about the arts right now is like, why are we in this military-industrial complex, and now, of course, surveillance-industrial complex? But when we look at how the arts help give us different paths, that's why we began the discussion with Da Vinci. With Tom, one of the things I wanted to riff with you again was better conversion of energy. The trees are one of the most critical things going, but at the end of the day, it's all these kinds of parts about conversion of energy. And you talked about the photon just recently. But say, for example, sunlight. The sun can power pretty much everything on this whole planet, the entire human civilization. If we woke up tomorrow and turned off every coal plant, turned off every nuclear power plant, and we'd still be able to have the sun. So where do you think for the next about 2 years, your project about the trees initiative, how is that going to be involved with some of the issues that we've been looking at with other alternative power sources as well?
Yeah, so I run a fund, and if anybody wants to go support the youth, I'm raising capital for my fund. Ta-da! Anyway, super micro plug. Anyway, the trees aren't necessarily, we don't want to go grow all the trees and then cut them down to make biofuels or burn them as biomass energy. That's not really the point. We want to use them as a way to fully restore ecosystems and sequester a huge amount of carbon in the process. But relative to energy storage, there's a bunch of things that we can do, and some of the stuff that I'm looking at investing in right now includes alternative ways of making energy storage for grid utility scale storage. And everybody just presume, oh, it's going to be lithium batteries, but problem with that is that just the amount of mining that you need to do, you need to mine a bunch of cobalt, which is a serious conflict mineral. It's not a good idea to actually do utility scale lithium ion sort of stuff. And even lithium air stuff. If you look down these chemistries, it's like both in terms of the mining overhead and the potential social impacts, ecological social impacts, it's kind of disastrous. But if you were to loosen the constraint just a little bit, because the constraint is a little bit looser, like grid power, this sort of backup storage on grid power is meant to give you kind of a balancing effect on the intermittency of renewable power, right? Because sometimes the wind's blowing, sometimes the sun's shining, sometimes it's not. So you need a little bit of a balancing effect. But that balancing effect is not for months. It might be for a couple of days. And actually, if you're willing to accept a battery that loses 5% of its charge per day, then actually, you can still smooth out intermittency over a couple of days, no problem. And when you loosen that constraint just a little bit, then it opens things up to lots of chemistries that do not require conflict minerals, that are way more easy to scale up, lower capex, easier opex. So I'm investing in some things related to that.
So I'm going to switch over again.
Okay.
All right. So
that Robert Redford pick, he has a very like Where's Waldo vibe.
right. Yeah, that was a funny one. I was like,
That?
yeah. All right. So just recently, Ethiopia planted over 350 million trees in one day, and that's good news, right? I mean, I think can we just like, whoa. And it was in 12 hours where they took a leadership initiative to say, look, we really need to actually really rethink the way that trees in their society work. So the best thing of all of that is they're now making it a bigger thing. It's called the Great Green Wall Initiative. And again, I want to make sure when you're talking about conflict initiatives, most of the brush fire wars going on in the world right now, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, they're all going to be flashpoints for climate refugee issues. So what they're trying to do throughout this region in the Sahel and the Sahara is plant a wall of trees at the base of the Sahel Desert and then move upwards towards the Sahara. This year, I'm artist in residence at Google, and I'll be doing a series of initiatives in Timbuktu because it's going to be one of the first. It's one of these cities that was at the edge of the desert, and the desert's actually growing. Again, that's going to be an art project. It'll go to the various museums, and we're looking at how data and the contemporary art initiatives that I look at are being able to kind of create a better, more robust conversation between data scientists, artists, and above all, that interdisciplinary space of code. So I'm working with a group of scientists to look at how deserts are growing. But again, that was all inspired by my expeditions to Antarctica. And that eventually became a series of concerts. I just want to show you for quick, we did the biggest Earth Day that's happened a couple of years back. We had about 1.5 million people facing the Washington Monument. I'll just show you that really quickly, where I took all of my music that I generated in Antarctica. This is me DJing. It was me, the Flaming Lips, the Roots. I mean, Cherteska's cool, but trust me, the Roots are a different league. It's a different zone. So when we did this, the whole concert was based on climate material that I had turned into hip hop, techno, dubstep, and so on. And again, the whole concert was based on environmental issues. I don't know if you guys like the Roots or Flaming Lips. I don't know if this is the demographic for that. But I don't DJ in Colorado. Yeah, right. I'm usually an East Coast guy in San Francisco, so I do this kind of festivals there. Maybe next year with Chip will talk. We'll do a big environmental music festival here. But that was a really powerful event, and I do want to give a quick shout to. We have one of the organizers of the March for Science here, Valerie Aquino. If you want to just wave for a second, just say hey. And the March for Science was also came up a little while ago, and you can realize, I just want to show you really quickly what that would look like. That was Ethiopia. Yeah, this is one of the largest gatherings of scientists in the world, and it was that was April 22nd on Earth Day as well, so I ended up hosting a lot of the scientists after that underneath DuPont Circle. I don't know if everybody knows DuPont in DC. That was an abandoned subway station, and DC has a whole bunch of subways, so we repurposed that for an event. And again, the urban landscape is one of these places where we have to really, the bulk of humanity is going to be living in cities, so we really have to rethink how urban landscape and narrative convene to give people a different sense of how climate affects everyone. So Tom, again, the reason I was showing the Ethiopia project is that happened in one day. They planted, but you can do something like that with drones. You want to talk about the drones thing as well?
Well, actually, I think it's fantastic for human beings to be planting as well, because it invites a type of kind of commitment from the community that can last for a long time. And so I think all of that stuff is amazing. You were talking about desertification. There is a way that you can plan planting that you can push back desertification, because there's a mechanism that's called the biotic pump. And effectively what happens when trees transpire and it gets into the upper atmosphere, that stuff collapses to water vapor, creates a low pressure area. If that's anywhere within like 100 miles of the shore, that low pressure area will actually bring in all this moist air from the ocean, and it'll keep on going inland, oftentimes hundreds of miles, even 1,000 miles. Mm-hmm. So like when you're looking at the Sahara, actually there are ways of potentially planting near the perimeter that could potentially change the overall level of desert in the Sahara period.
And it's a really good example of that is when Darwin was doing his first expedition around the world. There was this one British refueling station called Ascension Island. It's in the middle of the Atlantic, and some of Darwin's seeds fell off the crates from the ship. And he came back a couple years later, and the seeds had sprouted trees on this island that had formerly been kind of a barren wasteland in the middle of the ocean. And the Ascension Island project is literally considered the world's first artificial ecosystem.
Yeah.
So the entire ecosystem of the island changed. And like you said, trees began to grow. They brought in clouds. Clouds brought in more palm trees, grass, etc. So it became this crazy collage of all the major ecosystems that Darwin had collected on his voyage around the world.
Yeah.
So there were seeds from every major continent. And so actually those seeds would never be on the same place. And so they actually became a cooperative ecosystem. If you have a free moment, Ascension Island is really fascinating. A lot of people, again, have done a lot of research about this place. But Darwin wrote about it because the next time he came around the world, the whole island was green and glowing and had all this great kind of, like you said, biomass and all sorts of stuff happening. So a good example. So what do you think we can do over the next 2 years, because we have a year plus of Trump, and perhaps longer if Russian he's like president as Russian malware. So there's a lot of layers of how the legacy of Trump is going to echo around for a while, mainly with the judicial. He's put in a lot of judges over the next over the last him and Mitch McConnell. I don't believe in hell, but maybe we can banish them to a low data intensive climate someplace. That's hell, right? If your cell phone doesn't work. So let's talk about that for a second, because we have about 5 minutes left. What's next steps for you?
Oh, well, very quickly on Trump, it's like one way to take apart patriarchy is to elect a terrible patriarch. And then we actually just stop believing in patriarchy. I'm just saying. And what patriarchy is basically a willful abdication of your power to somebody who's supposed to lord power over you. So it's like, and it doesn't need to be a person, it can be a religion, it can be any sort of system where it's like, oh, I look up to you, the person who knows all of it, that's going to exert your power so wisely. And when we elect a terrible patriarch, we start to realize, oh, that's a shitty system, period. Like, why did we give up our power in the first place? And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have better leaders, that's fine, but actually patriarchy was terrible. The first step where we gave up our power was all messed up. We should have kept some of the power near us, because we can plant our own gardens, we can plant our own trees, you can organize stuff and plant 300 million trees in a day. Like, these are things where it wasn't the government saying, hey, well, okay, now that I've decided, I have the most guns, we're going to plant the most trees. It never happens like that, right? Like it's always us retaining our own power. So I look at the Trump situation, and maybe it goes on another year and a half, maybe it goes on another 5.5 years. In either case, we need to just be done with patriarchy from the inside out. And whoever we elect, we're going to be their co-authors.
The discussion, the reason I wanted to show that Ethiopia initiative is that it was African-led, and it was based on indigenous practices, and above all, there was this sort of patronizing. A lot of times the Westerners will come and start lecturing people all over the world, especially Americans. We love doing that. But that was a ground-up, kind of thing from their own cultural system. For you, I know that you move between Hawaii, San Francisco, New York. I live in New York, but I've been coming out to Colorado a lot. For me, how do we... If you were to say to artists and some of the creatives in the room here, looking at the imagination right now, we're living in a data-intensive society. And this is something I want to make sure that everyone in the room realizes, is that there's different kinds of approaches to code. Like, culture is in collision with code right now. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts about innovation, design? I mean, these are all things that you've come out of with Google X, for example.
Yeah.
That's a broad brushstroke there, but I wanted to just get your thoughts on that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, if the nexus of power is moving to data, then the main question is who decides what the data is. Is the data going to be about all your personal preferences so I can manipulate you? Or is the data going to be about deeply understanding the health of the soil or the coral reef? And I'm going to tell you, we have a lot more data on how to manipulate you than we have on soils and coral reefs.
Yeah, that's why Ray-Ban ads are here in Colorado on a sunny day, coming up on my laptop.
Yeah, there you go. and like you were mentioning the nuclear thing before, like I have a simple rule of thumb that technology is always wielded at the level of consciousness of the civilization that wields it. And back when we split the atom, we were the consciousness right before World War I. And what did we do with that? We didn't make carbon-free power for all of humanity. We decided to make the most fearsome arsenal that humanity had ever seen. And for the first time, be able to destroy all of humanity. And here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and we've got all this data stuff. You know, we have split the atom metaphorically in terms of artificial intelligence. And the level of consciousness that we're at right now is a commerce consciousness. So the most sophisticated AI in the world right now is serving you ads and trading stocks. Fully commerce driven. We're not using it to go restore the environment. I mean, my teams are. But it's like, other than a small, you know, whatever, enclave, and let's say that's hundreds of people, because it's certainly not, you know, 1,000 yet. Other than an enclave of hundreds of people, we're not using artificial intelligence with a level of consciousness that's beyond commerce right now.
Right. And commerce is one of those weird things that everyone thinks is so all-pervasive, but we really need to develop different kinds of models for capital, and I think that's one of the eerie legacies of the 19th and 18th centuries idea of finance. Adam Smith, who wrote you know, The Wealth of Nations, which generally most people would say is the touchstone for modern economics, give or take. He had a great phrase where he said, all money is a matter of belief. And so I use that as a kind of a way to rethink the art form of commerce, because it's about mechanisms of exchange. So if you're in YAP, for example, remember you're talking about social exchange, social currencies. There's a lot of things that we could easily transition from. I mean, I'll give you an example. The first cars were electric, and then the automobile and oil industries lobbied to get most of the roads repaved in a certain way. And then, of course, we had the Model T Ford car, which radically transformed the American road systems. And next thing you know, we're now in this car economy, but they got rid of the electric car. So we've had solutions for many of these issues for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, if commerce is an art form, you know, of belief, actually belief has its own art form as well. And we're not very artful with our beliefs right now. Like, there's a type of, you know, being able to look at our own beliefs, challenge them, you know, understand ourselves deeply that we are needing to go through at this moment. And it's expressing itself through trauma, tragedy, through conflict, through separation, through tribalism. And this is the call. This is the call for us to kind of step up and really begin the mastery of the art form of our beliefs.
There we go. So,